So it's wonderful to know that we have an afternoon audience for our afternoon programs. We had over 150 people show interest today, so again, we'll be welcoming everyone in just one moment.
Charlotte, is the chat activated?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to get started now. We still have some people logging in, but we'll get through my remarks and hopefully then everyone will be all set. Good afternoon. I'm Charlotte Wood, the Assistant Library Director of the Wilmington Memorial Library. Today's lecture, Why Native Plant Landscapes Matter, is sponsored by the Wilmington, Chelmsford, and Andover libraries. I'd like to welcome patrons from all three and anyone else who may be joining us. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Wilmington Library for partially funding this event with funds raised from their 2019 annual appeal. That money was earmarked for a year-long series of programs called Wilmington's Earth Year, which was to have kicked off last April, but was sidetracked due to the pandemic. We are reviving the series this April and have many earth-friendly events planned, as do the other participating libraries. Be sure to check out the library's websites to see what's coming up. Please use the chat box today for any questions. You'll find the chat box at the bottom of your screen. So please type your questions in there and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. I would like to introduce our speaker, Claudia Thompson, who has had a lifelong interest in environmental issues and was one of the many leaders of the first Earth Day in 1970. In 2010, she founded Grow Native Massachusetts and served as its first president after having her own epiphany about the potential of her small urban garden to support life for birds and to improve biodiversity. In addition, Claudia has worked as the Director of Education for the Appalachian Mountain Club, the Director of Drumlin Farm Wildlife Sanctuary for Mass Audubon, and served on the board of the New England Wildlife Society for 9 years. She holds degrees from the University of Rochester. She has a BA in Biology and Environmental Studies from there. She has a Master's of Fine Arts in Graphic Design from the Rhode Island School of Design, and a Master's in Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School with a concentration in environmental policy. You're in good hands today, and on that note, I'd like to welcome Claudia.
Well, hello, everybody. And thank you so much, Charlotte, for a very kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. And I thank you to all of the Wilmington Library and the Andover Library and to all of you in Chelmsford as well for sponsoring this. Let's jump in and get going. And I will talk for about an hour. And then I hope we'll have about half an hour for Q&A, which Charlotte will be helping with. So why do native plant landscapes matter? And in order to answer that question, we need to first agree on what are native plants. So in short, my computer is having a hard time with this. In short, all plants, as far as we know, are native to planet Earth. And it's easier to tell that joke in person, but we don't yet know of any extraterrestrials of plants that have arrived here from outer space. So when we talk about native plants, we need to understand what we mean. And it means those plants are local. It means they've had a long period of time to evolve here in this ecosystem, thousands of years, millions of years. For very practical purposes in New England, we use the breaking point of European colonization to consider whether plants are native or not. If they were here in this region before colonists arrived by ships from other continents, then we consider them native. And another word commonly used is indigenous. Now, every plant species is quite variable in its range. And so you have to talk about that particular plant to know what its native range is. So for example, a red oak tree is native from southern Canada all the way down the eastern seaboard west to the Mississippi and down towards Georgia. That's a very big range for that particular species. There are other plants like the rare Plymouth gentian in Massachusetts, which is native only to very unique areas of Cape Cod. So the range of every species is quite different. Now let's take a little bit of a very big picture historical look at why plant species are different around the globe. And the reason is that approximately 200 years ago is what we now think, the Earth was made up of a single landmass called Pangaea. And it was at that time that the continents were all lumped together. But what we know from the theory of continental drift is that soon after or around that time, the continents of North America and South America and Europe and Asia began drifting apart. And in fact, actually, that drift can still be measured today in a matter of, so many centimeters per year. It's pretty amazing, really. But on the other hand, it's also kind of common sense in a certain way, because if you look at the map of North America and South America and Europe and Africa, it's always seemed like those continents fit together. So a couple 100 million years ago, we've got all the land massed together, and life on the planet is still relatively primitive, as we say. So plants a couple 100 million years ago were really still largely mosses. There were vascular plants developing, but there were not yet any flowering plants on the globe at that time. And what's really interesting is that the flowering plants did not start evolving until about 125 million years ago. And that explains why we have this significant difference in species from continent to continent, because it wasn't until the continents had started drifting well apart and were maybe halfway to where they are today that we even had flowering plants at all. And that means that we may have the genus, the roots of the species in common in Europe or Asia or North America. But the species themselves tended to evolve quite separately from continent to continent. There are very few plants on Earth that can be found around the globe as one species, where one species could be found around the globe. And those are only generally very northern plants that live at the North Pole region and a little bit south. They're called the circumboreal region. And it may be that the climatic and conditions in Siberia, northern Siberia, are close enough to northern Canada that some species evolved that are adapted to those same conditions around the globe. But it is more rare than not for species to be unique to different continents, in particular, different regions of the globe. So the essential why of why native plants are important and why the crux of this issue has to do with this complicated coevolution then in the ecosystem between plants and animals, the relationships of the different species within those systems, which developed over a long period of time. We're paying a lot of attention to that these days in our talk about pollinators and how important pollinators are. And in fact, there are some pollinators that are uniquely adapted to only be able to pollinate one particular species of plant. Some pollinators are a little bit more generalist, but they're still only going to be able to pollinate certain species of plants. So there's a tight relationship evolutionarily between the species of plants in any part of the world and the pollinators that help pollinate those plants. Plants, in addition, don't like to be eaten. So just like animals really don't like to be eaten, neither do plants, but they can't run away to defend themselves. The way they defend themselves is to make themselves inedible to virtually every other animal on the continent. So if you, for example, go outside right now and grab whatever plants you find growing outside the door of the building that you're in, most likely you're not going to be able to eat most of those plants. We're adapted to eating the plants that we have limited species, some that we've cultivated, but a few that we have not. But there are only a few of those species that we can eat. And similarly, if you think about butterflies and moths, which are called a class of insects, Lepidoptera is the scientific term. Lepidoptera are very uniquely host specific in the reproduction, meaning that a lot of caterpillars can only eat one particular species or a small group of species of plants and survive and reproduce. And of course, the poster child for that is the monarch butterfly, being able to only eat milkweeds. So only with milkweeds does the monarch butterfly survive. But that's also true for many different species of caterpillars, of butterflies, moths, that they are host specific. So there may be a range of a few species that they can reproduce on, that their larvae, their little caterpillars can eat, but they can't reproduce on most species of plants. So the bottom line is that there's a very complex set of co-evolutionary relationships between plants and animals that make the ecosystem work. We humans actually don't know a whole lot about these relationships. There's so many, they're so infinite, they're so complex, but we're learning more all the time. So the first reason that native plants are so important to all of us is simply to keep the ecosystem stable, to preserve biodiversity. If we don't have that system able to function, it starts to collapse. And again, the poster child for the coevolution is monarch butterflies. And I think a lot of you probably know the life cycle of the butterfly, but just quickly, I will review that. Overwintering here in Mexico, down here at this little spot, is a massive group of monarchs. And probably they're just at the point, or maybe they were at the point a few weeks ago, where they wake up from their winter sort of semi-tuberous state. And these adults have been clustered together, keeping each other warm in the trees. And what the monarchs do when they wake up, and I hope you can see my little cursor here, is they fly north to Texas. And then they find milkweed in Texas. And the male and the female will mate, and the female will lay her eggs on the milkweed plant. And then both adults die, because in butterfly life cycles, after they've mated and the female lays her eggs, that's the end of their life cycle. That's the end of that adult's life. So hopefully, those larvae on the milkweed survive and they hatch, and they're right there on the one plant they can eat, the milkweed. And these little teeny larvae nibble the milkweed enough to grow into caterpillars, and then those caterpillars finally pupate. And those adult butterflies might fly to Missouri. And the same cycle happens again, where the adults lay the egg, the female lays the egg, the adults die, the larvae hatch, hopefully they're on milkweed, and that generation maybe goes to Ohio. It takes 4 or 5 generations of monarch butterflies every spring and summer to make it up here to New England. So when we start to see monarch butterflies in July and August, that's the 4th or 5th generation of the great-great-grandparents that were down in Mexico last winter. And it's just a remarkable story that almost seems crazy. It took about 30 years for research on the life cycle of the monarch butterfly to reveal this story. The work was pioneered by a small group of people, but in particular, a woman and her husband, Laura Urquhart. And they didn't begin their work until the 1960s. It didn't fully understand the life cycle of the monarch until about 1994 or so. Just a little reminder in how humble we should be about how much there is to know about the incredible ecosystems that we live on. And of course, if you're here in New England and you want to support life for monarch butterflies, there are 5 species of milkweeds that you can grow or plant, or perhaps let live if you have common milkweed already in your gardens or fields. The common milkweed, the Asclepias syriaca, is the most vigorous one that spreads stoloniferously. And so some people, if they have a small garden, prefer some of the clumping milkweeds because those are better behaved. But all of these milkweeds are good host plants for the monarch butterfly.
Claudia, it's Charlotte. Yeah. I'm just going to ask you, if you have your chat box up, can you minimize it? It might be creating a gray area on the slide. If you have,
I do not have the chat box up.
All right.
Does that help what I just did?
No, there's a gray box, but I mean, people can see most everything, and I can see the gray box that they're talking about, but we thought perhaps it was your chat box. So I would say just continue on. And
where's the gray box showing, Charlotte?
It's kind of in the upper right corner. And well, at least in my screen, I think in some people's screens, it may be different.
So it is maybe?
Yeah. Is
that help?
Yes. Yes, you're moving it, whatever you just did.
That's actually the Zoom box.
Oh, the Zoom box. Interesting.
That's
Okay.
showing. So let me
Okay.
see.
All right.
I can try to get rid of it entirely, maybe.
Okay. So
although
thank you. It's in my bottom right screen now, and I can see most of your slides. So now it's larger now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something Zoom is doing
There.
this.
Okay. It's smaller now. So whatever you did.
Does that help?
Yes, I think it did help.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. Yeah, it's in the bottom right, but it's smaller.
I know it's
Yes. But
this
thank
is
you. Sorry to interrupt. I think that'll work for most people.
okay.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. So just briefly, let's think about the introduction of non-natives into New England. And as I said, since we define plants that were already here at that time as natives, then this happened as European colonization happened. The biggest reason that plants were brought here was us gardeners and botanists. We love plants, we're interested in plants, we like how they look. Explorers and botanists would go to other continents and say, oh my gosh, that's such a beautiful plant. We don't have that here, so let me take that home with us. And similarly, the colonists and people who were traveling to this country liked to bring plants with them that they knew from home. So second biggest reason that plants have been brought here was for conservation purposes. And particularly in the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, we planted really great plants like kudzu, plants that would grow fast, that we thought would stabilize the soil. And that's just an indication of how much the ideas about our ideas and understanding of conservation has changed over a century or decades. We're constantly learning that some of our past practices weren't actually best conservation practices. And plants, of course, were always introduced for herbal and medicinal purposes. Garlic mustard, I'll bet a lot of you have invasive garlic mustard in your gardens. That was brought here by the colonists because it was believed to have good properties for health. And then, of course, we always get some accidental hitchhikers. If we think then, too, about what was the New England ecosystem like here after colonization began, a lot of New England was very quickly cleared for farmland when the colonists arrived. And the peak of farming was around the time of the Second World War. And this is a photo of the Harvard dioramas out at Harvard Forest. They have a great set of dioramas showing what the changes in the New England landscape over time from the time of colonization. And it's pretty dramatic to see how much of New England was cleared. And those of us that know the stone walls and the fields, even up on the mountainous parts of New England, can see how extensive farming was. After the Civil War, the trains were being developed. Colonists started moving west, and they discovered that the fertile farmlands of some of the Ohio and Midwestern regions were a lot less rocky, a lot easier to grow crops like wheat, and that had to be processed more. So farming began to decline in New England at that time. And what happened is that a lot of New England became reforested, but reforested still with native plants. It was the seed bank of the surrounding woodlands that was germinating and was having these abandoned farm fields go through succession. So really, New England was still a native plant landscape well into the 1900s. And it wasn't until the time of the Second World War and the development that started really extensively after that in the 1950s that New England landscape began to change pretty radically. So if we look at plants in Massachusetts today, and we look at the species in Massachusetts today, and I'm not referring to our agricultural crops in this chart, but I am referring to all the native or naturalized plants. There are about 2,700 species of plants in Massachusetts that can reproduce themselves in the landscape. And of that, about 1/3 or a little less than 2,000 are native species. And maybe close to 1,000 are non-native species. But that doesn't mean that the biomass of the plants in New England are largely native, because we're talking about species, not the total amount of plant material here and the abundance of the species. And in fact, of all the native species, at least 25% of those species are at high risk of significant population loss or possibly extinction. So if you were to look at the biomass of the plant material in Massachusetts, it's heavily tilting towards non-native, particularly in all the more developed areas of the state. Now, within the non-native species, there's a broad spectrum of behavior in the ecosystem. We all know now that we have an invasive species list in Massachusetts, and there are about 145 species on that list. There are non-native species such as lilacs or Queen Anne's lace or so many other plants that are not invasive, but they're not native. So they don't have the same role in the ecosystem. So there's this very broad spectrum of behavior of the non-native plants, from present in the ecosystem, but probably not playing an ecological role in that co-evolutionary way, to really invasive and causing damage to the ecosystem. And I just want to quickly mention some of the invasive species that are on the Massachusetts list and that are now regulated. A lot of you probably know them, but upper left is black swallowwort, bittersweet, Japanese knotweed, Norway maple. And then we have also garlic mustard, which these top two photos are garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is a biennial, so it has a 2-year life cycle, where in the first year it's a low rosette of leaves and it doesn't flower until the second year. Down here we have Japanese barberry, and here we have Japanese honeysuckle. In Massachusetts, the invasive list became effective in 2006. There was a 3-year phase-in for some plants that were still being sold in the nursery trade. If you're a plant, if you're a species that has made it onto the Massachusetts list, what that means is it is now illegal for us to distribute the plant, to give it to friends, to carry its seeds, to buy it, to sell it, to any way aid its further propagation in the world, in the state. You are not required to remove the invasive species from your property, but most of us in the ecological realm would encourage you to. It's interesting to reflect on the fact that this whole understanding of plants and how they behave, and this whole understanding that some species are so damaging to the ecosystem that they become classified as invasive, is still relatively new in our scientific understanding. The word invasive didn't really exist in our lexicon until the mid-1900s. We didn't understand that plant behavior even a century ago. So just let's make sure we understand our terminology. Native, we've talked about. Non-native, introduced by humans in a sudden way from a distant ecological place. Naturalized, I want to be sure we know what that word means. So naturalized simply means that you are a plant species or an animal species that's able to reproduce on your own within the ecosystem without cultivation by human beings. So many, many plants here are naturalized. It does not mean they're invasive. The ones that are classified as invasive are the ones that have been scientifically demonstrated to really cause disruption in a measurable way within the system. And again, in Massachusetts, the group that put the whole original invasive list together and helps inform the state in maintaining it is the Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group, that is comprised of people from the nursery trade, from conservation community, from government agencies, from some citizens, scientists, again, nursery folks. The whole idea was to have a coalition of people who would work collaboratively rather than in opposition to one another to agree on which species should be so regulated. So now that we've gone through that intro, I want to spend the rest of the time talking about native plants. And why should you not use that Cornus kousa, that non-native Cornus kousa from the Asian part of the world, instead of our native Cornus florida? And there's really one simple answer to that, and that is that the Cornus kousa didn't evolve here. it doesn't host insects and arthropods. So our beautiful native dogwood, which you see here, the Cornus florida, hosts about 117 species of moths and butterflies. It actually has a role to play in our ecosystem. But that non-native Cornus cusa, this one here, that actually doesn't host any insects. So it may have some flowers that you think are pretty, but it isn't performing a function in the ecosystem. So here's the crux of it. The reason native plants are essential to the rest of life in Massachusetts and New England is that they host insects. And why is that important? It's because insects are the web of life. And our good friend E.O. Wilson, probably most of you know of him, makes the point, has often made the point that without insects and arthropods, we have no food for birds, no food for salamanders and amphibians, and no food web. And I love his quote, insects are the little things that run the world. So think about it. You know, terrestrial birds, songbirds in particular, feed their young only insects because that's all the young can eat when they're growing so fast, and they need all that protein to grow within a matter of weeks into birds that can fly. So here's a palm warbler, and it's got a caterpillar, and it's taking that caterpillar to its young so that its young can grow. And fortunately, to help keep the ecosystem in balance, we have insects that eat insects. Again, it's a very complex system. And I'll bet you most of us love great blue herons. The great blue heron is not eating insects per se, but that frog was just eating the insects that now the heron is eating the frog. So once again, our friend E.O. Wilson sums everything up by saying, if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed just 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And that's just a little point to rest our thoughts on for a moment. The world doesn't really need us as a species. The ecosystem would probably do just fine without us. But without insects, we could not survive. It's a little hard to grasp sometimes in the way we live our lives, and yet it is very true. So in the native plant world, I bet you a lot of you have heard of Doug Tallamy and maybe read his books. Doug studies insects. He is the professor of entomology at the University of Delaware. And he had been working on this issue for several decades now, back around the early 2000s. He needed some projects for his PhD students to do, and they started counting the insects on native plants versus non-native plants, since Doug was interested in this issue. And they started to actually document the remarkable differences between the amount of insects on native plants versus on non-native plants. So Doug's first book, Bringing Nature Home, was published in 2007. And it was really a groundbreaking piece of work, and was certainly in the gardening world an absolute bestseller that has made him famous, so that he's been traveling the country ever since, giving lots of talks. And his second book just came out last year, Nature's Best Hope. And that is both books. There are a lot of similarities. I'd recommend that you read both of them. I think if you get excited about this, you'll want to read both of them, but read one or the other. Pick whichever one suits your fancy the most. And you'll really get this whole background on native plants supporting insect life, supporting bird life, and supporting the rest of life on the planet. I think the biggest difference between the two books is that in Nature's Best Hope, Doug more fully goes into why this is important on every piece of land, big or small, which is exactly the mission of Grow Native, the Grow Native Massachusetts, just that every piece of land is so important. And Doug sums up his science, saying that his research shows that native ornamental plants support 29 times the biodiversity than do alien ornamentals.
Oh, Claudia, this is Charlotte. I just wanted to mention that Doug Tallamy will be speaking via Zoom. I put it in the chat box, Tuesday, April 27th at 7, hosted by the Andover Library.
Is this next week?
It's April 27th.
Excellent. Well,
yes.
I hope every single one of you will sign up for that. He's a wonderful speaker, and just you'll really enjoy it. So 2 reasons now to use native plants. We've talked about biodiversity, insects, and the stability of local ecosystems, but I want to say a little bit also about climate change, a huge, huge issue of our day. And native plants, using native plants and using them well, also involves using ecological processes in new ways. So we all know these charts. We know that climate change is this dramatically increasing challenge for the planet, and that the significant changes in greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in the last 80 years, are having a profound impact on the globe. So I don't need to go over that, but how is it that native plants help? And I would summarize it this way, that using natives also really gives us the opportunity to choose the right species for your conditions, for your place. Often people say, if you use native plants, you won't have to water them, you won't have to do, your life will be easier. That's a little bit of an oversimplification. What is not oversimplified, however, is that native plants are adapted to the soil and climate that they evolved in. And so if you understand your soil and your climate in your garden or your landscape and choose species that are well adapted to those conditions, you will be able to create a garden using ecological processes in which you don't have to use chemical fertilizers, in which you're getting the system to work itself. And that alone is a significant step in terms of helping, one important step in helping to reduce climate change. And why is that? Just a teeny bit about the chemical fertilizer industry. The chemical fertilizer industry rose really as an outgrowth of the Second World War because of World War II weapons production. There was an excess of nitrous oxide that had been used to produce weapons, and various manufacturers discovered they could use that to produce fertilizers. And all of a sudden, fertilizer production, synthetic fertilizer production, became a major industry in the US. And so it's pretty remarkable how fast that happened. And what we now know about these synthetic fertilizers is that they actually also kill the soil. They kill the life in the soil. And the other thing that we're learning from a climate change point of view is that healthy organic soils that have a robust food web in the soil actually also sequester a lot of carbon. So if we can completely get away from chemical fertilizers, not only are we not having these massive plants that are producing these fertilizers all over the country and emitting all kinds of pollutants and greenhouse gases in the processes and trucking them across the country, but we are making our soil healthy, and that in turn is going to sequester more carbon. So how do we use ecological processes with native plants? We want to leave our leaf litter as much as possible. We want to have an understory that instead of bringing in mulches that have to be trucked in from somewhere else, we're using the plant ground plane as the understory underneath the larger trees and shrubs that serve essentially as our weed suppression layer, as well as a healthy layer for birds and butterflies and insects and wildlife. So in my own garden, for example, I do not use any synthetic fertilizers. The leaf litter is there, and that is my mulch in effect, and it gets delivered free. And I try to have as rich an understory as possible. Here's a part of my garden that's coming up every spring. And again, there's you can see a little leaf litter left from the winter, but once the plants come out and germinate, the entire understory of the garden is covered with beautiful, healthy growing plants. And again, no chemical fertilizers at all. So I think we know that our human impact on the landscape is huge. The way we've developed land in the last century in particular, we've been fragmenting our habitat into smaller and smaller parcels, which has made it very hard for wildlife and bird life to sustain itself. We can't completely reverse that process, but if we manage all of our landscapes, large and small, to promote biodiversity, there's a lot we can do to reverse the declines in songbirds and amphibians and butterflies and other important fauna in our ecosystem. And then in climate change, of course, I think we know that our warmest years on record have really been in the last 2 decades. There's so much that we need to do to work on the climate change problem. So just quickly going back to looking at what has happened in the US since the Second World War, here's some charts to show housing density. And obviously red means the more dense areas. And just a quick glance, we see what happens: 1960, 1990, 2010, and that was just 10 years ago. If you look at that map right there, you'll see that Massachusetts, the housing density throughout well into the western part of the state here is more than 100 units per kilometer. And that means that most of our landscapes look something like this. And hence our motto at Grow Native, that every garden matters, every landscape counts. If we all really make some changes, again, there is so much we can do to support life for the ecosystem health. And what I'm going to do for the rest of the half hour of the talk is give you a little tour of my garden as a case study. And it's been a real learning experience for me. I did not start out early in my gardening years understanding the ecological importance of my own garden. It's really something that the garden has taught me. So I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and thanks to Google Earth, we can zoom down and see where I live. And so it's a part of the city that there is some tree cover, but I live in a neighborhood of 2 family houses. And there I am. You can get a sense that the house takes up about 1/3 of the lot, but I'm fortunate enough to, again, live in a neighborhood where we do have some tree canopy and the opportunity to do some gardening. This is what my lovely property looked like when my husband and I bought it in 1992. I still chuckle when I look at it. It was what you call a fixer-upper. And that was the view of the house from the back. And I will say again that I didn't start out understanding the ecological potential of this relatively small property, but this is what it looks like or looked like maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I started working on it right away. And the first thing that we did was take down that absolutely disgusting garage, which had been the cat's clubhouse. And we couldn't wait to get rid of that. Taking up some of the asphalt. But I will say that I started out fairly conventionally. We took down the garage, we took up some of the asphalt. We didn't have enough money to do a lot of renovations on the house other than put in heat and hot water, which was kind of important. But we had to bring in some topsoil where we took the garage down. And my husband and I went to Weston Nurseries, and we did what most people do. We walked around and we looked for things in our hardiness zone. We picked plants by how they looked for color, texture. We wanted a variety of trees and shrubs, but we did not actively plan out that garden as an ecosystem. So it took me, I would say, between 92, 93 and well into the year 2000s to really start to evolve my garden and think of it more ecologically. And it was a lot of succession, a lot of experimentation. So right now, what I'm going to do is just give you a tour of some of the favorite native species. And again, so many things happened over time. The neighbor had an elm tree, and the elm tree died. We planted these particular trees right here, these Amelanchier trees, when the neighbor's elm died, because we wanted some trees to kind of give us some privacy. There was a lot of moving around of trees and shrubs in my experimentation. And I wish that, 25 years ago, I had understood a little bit more of what I understand now, but that's kind of inherent in our human lives, isn't it? That we say, I wish I had known back then what I know now. So these are Amelanchias. They're also called shadbush or shadblow, and sometimes also called Juneberry. And they bloom, they're about to bloom right now. Mine are bursting out. They're not quite this far along. They're probably about 10 days away. They're called shadbush because they bloom when the shad are running. They're called serviceberry because they bloom when the ground has thawed enough for the colonists to bury the dead. And they're called Juneberry because their berries ripen in June. Another favorite understory in my garden is bloodroot. Bloodroot is one of our early native wildflowers, and like a crocus, the flowers open in the sun. Once they're pollinated, the petals drop, and after pollination, they have these wonderful leaves that unfurl just artistically, gorgeously, and become dominant in the understory. Really, really great wildflowers. Here's a little Uvularia sicilifolia, which is mixed in with the an anemonella. Just again, very nice understory plants. So again, you'll see in my garden that the leaf litter is part of my understory. It's my naturally occurring mulch that came down in the fall, and the native perennials bloom and emerge and bloom right through it. Here's the bloodroot leaves, which really can persist well into the summer, and then mixed with a little bit of yellow lady slipper. There's the yellow lady slipper in bloom. It is one of the cultivated lady slippers that you can purchase from Native Plant Trust or sometimes other suppliers. Please don't dig any lady slippers from the wild. They will not survive if you do that. We don't know how to cultivate the pink lady slipper, but there are a few species of lady slippers that can be cultivated, and this is one. Here's Phlox stolonifera, very nice spreading ground cover type plant, beautiful spring flowers. Again, here's the kind of rich understory in June. This is June, that has come up and emerged after the winter. You see actually there's a little bit of a native azalea tucked right there and a teeny bit of blueberry in here, but most of these are ferns perennials that have emerged every year up from what was the bare winter layer. I have some jack-in-the-pulpit and also some trilliums. And in this slide, you can see here is the jack-in-the-pulpit leaf, and here's the trillium leaf. They almost look similar. The jack-in-the-pulpit has a central vein, and it has these veins that come off to the side like this, which make it distinguishable from the trillium, which has a central vein here. But you notice that the additional veins are more curved and come back almost like the edges of a football or something, and surround that central vein differently. What's fascinating about trilliums and jack-in-the-pulpits, and again, this is a leaf litter story, is that each of those species have to, they drop their seeds, and the seeds take at least 1 or 2 years to germinate. They have to overwinter in a period of what's called cold stratification for them to even germinate in the soil. And it takes a trillium at least 7 years before that plant grows large enough to produce its first flower. And it takes a jack-in-the-pulpit 5 years to do that. And so every year, let's say those seeds overwintered and were lucky enough to germinate the next spring. The first year, those plants might only be at most grow to be an inch tall. They're very vulnerable to being dug up by squirrels or rakes or whatever comes along. And then that fall, those plants will senesce and then overwinter again. And next year they'll grow a little bit bigger. So imagine taking 5 to 7 years before you grow large enough as a plant to flower. And yet here I have these beautiful flowers in my garden. And here's the jack-in-the-pulpit, which had been pollinated, and it's gone to seed in the fall. The seeds are ripening. They're going to drop on the ground, and maybe ants will actually eat elaiosomes on these seeds and carry them a little bit further away so that maybe they'll overwinter and germinate. But because I don't disturb the leaf litter, and I'm letting the garden work as an ecological system, I have some hope that I'm going to get more jack-in-the-pulpits and trilliums. So this is the connection to not only using native plants, but gardening with ecological systems working. Now, this is a section of mayapple in my back garden, mixing in with some sensitive fern. Here's another shot of it. These are two plants that are both somewhat vigorous, aggressive, and so I finally learned to pair them together because that way they can balance each other out a little bit. In my back garden, so in Cambridge where I live, there's a lot of clay soil that underlies right underneath the topsoil. And I don't get good drainage. So when we get a heavy rain, like an inch rainstorm or the 2-inch rainstorms that we get now, my back garden floods. Instead of fighting that, I try to work with species that want to grow in those conditions, and these two do well together. Here's a rhododendron vasei, which is one of the native azaleas. I'm very, very fond of the native azaleas. They really look beautiful to me in the understory. They're a really appropriate woodland plant. The rhododendron vasei is a little bit more of a southern species, but I consider it native enough to use here, and it's one of the few that you can get. The native rhododendrons and native azaleas are a little bit hard to find. Out front, we have a native Cornus Florida, and I think you know that I'm very fond of those native American dogwoods as well. Here's Tiarella, a great foam flower, the common name, a great native plant for gardens, mixed in with some Viburnum dentatum in the back and some ostrich fern. Here's Clethra alnifolia, summer sweet. It is a beautiful plant. It's great for pollinators. It has that wonderful smell in July, that just reason it's called summer sweet. It often likes to grow in the woodlands around wet edges and wet areas, but it's a very adaptable plant, native plant, that will grow in pretty conventional garden situations as well. Tucked into that, there's Clethra alnifolia in the fall, has beautiful fall interest as well, beautiful color. Tucked into my same back area again, here's a mix of blue lobelia, cinnamon fern, high bush blueberry, some native grasses, Carex appalachia. There's marsh marigold. There are a whole bunch of species mixed in here. This is actually my wettest spot. Again, this is the spot that floods when we get the 2-inch rains. I've even had a mallard swimming in the same spot in the spring one time. So again, I'm searching for species that will adapt well to those particular conditions. This is witch hazel, Homomilus virginiana, our native witch hazel that actually blooms in November. And it's a beautiful sight to see late fall, early winter. Sometimes the snow is even coming down. High bush blueberry is a plant that has gorgeous fall color. And my soil and my conditions are actually not at all good for the blueberries. I've wasted a bit of money trying to plant blueberries and growing them in my clay soil, which is not what they do like. But what I did with this one was actually had it in a pot by my back door for about 7-8 years, and it had this beautiful fall color, and it would overwinter in the pot, and I would just really treat it almost as an ornamental plant, but a beautiful native ornamental that was helping make my landscape look and feel really nice. This is New Jersey tea, a more commonly used native that's been a little bit discovered in the last 5 to 8 years. It's Ceanothus americanus. It's a very, very tough plant. It does like clay soil. It is a good pollinator plant as well, and also has nice fall interest. And I'm also very fond of the winter berries, Ilex verticillata. Here's a honeybee, not a native bee, on the female winterberry, and the ilexes, the winterberries, are dioecious, meaning you need a male and a female plant to get the berries. The males are one plant is a male, one separate plant is a female, and they have to cross-pollinate in order for the berries to be produced. I particularly like the straight species, Ilex verticillata. The berries are smaller. I think they're more, my observation is that they're more palatable to the birds. And what people are using now a lot for winter bouquets and decorations are also these winterberry berries, especially now that the bittersweet is on the invasive plant list and no longer legal to use as decorations or wreaths in the wintertime. So finally, what's the third reason to use native plants? They're just gorgeous. Interestingly, everybody who gardened in America and New England was using native plants almost exclusively in their gardens until, again, about the time of the Second World War, the post-Second World War era. There's a wonderful book called American Plants for American Gardens, and it was written by two women who were professors at Vassar College. One was a botanist and one was a landscape architect. And the chapters in that book were published in the 1920s, the late 1920s, in House Beautiful magazine. And these were chapters like the juniper hillside, the streamside, and that's what Americans read 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, we understood how beautiful our plants are, and I think we're rediscovering that today. So now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the birds that I've discovered in my garden, and really that's a big part of how I got so excited about native plants.
Claudia, Charlotte again. I'm going to interrupt you for just one moment. At the very bottom of the screen, there's another gray line, and it was blocking out, we think, the names of some of the flowers and plants in your garden. Can you see something at the very bottom of your screen?
It's my Zoom control.
Yeah, and just so the audience knows, I had our tech librarian up here. For some reason, your screen sharing is reflecting the Zoom components as well for some reason and showing them as gray. We've not seen that before. We'll figure out why. We don't know if it's, but so.
Yeah, that is really frustrating.
It is strange, but I don't think there's anything we can do about it. But maybe if you can just, maybe slowly say the name of whatever is on the screen, because people they don't see the writing. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thanks, Charlotte. And again,
right. Sorry about that to everyone. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Well, I thank you for letting me know. So the birds in my garden, what happened for me, and part of how I became so convinced about the importance of native species, was that the more I started using native, we bought the house in 92. In the 90s, we were starting to pay attention to invasive species, and I did get rid of about 11 invasive species on the property. And then as I was getting rid of the invasive species, I wasn't exclusively planting natives in the beginning. As I said, I was more of a conventional gardener, and I wasn't attuned to the ecological importance of natives back then. But the more I began to use native plants, the more I began to see more birds. So by about the year 2000, I started documenting the birds in my garden. And then, of course, the more I was seeing, then the science of understanding how important natives were to birds started to emerge more, although that's relatively new as well. And I evolved to using more and more, almost exclusively native species. And so it was really the birds that sold me on this. And that's a cedar waxwing. It's actually in the Amelanchier, which is also the Juneberry. And they arrive here like June 1st on the dot. They're always looking for those berries, waiting for them to ripen. And they're so reliable. But there are lots of birds that love those berries. If we think for just a quick minute about why are we losing so dramatically the bird species, particularly the migrating species, and the declines are astounding. There's a 2016 study showing that universally across North American species, we're losing about 2/3 of our bird species are in decline, and some of them in very, very dramatic decline. And the reason, I think, is clear when we think about their life cycle. So the wood thrush, beautiful wood thrush, it lives in the winter over here in Central America. And it has to fly a couple thousand miles each year to get up to Massachusetts and then get back down to Central America for the winter. It weighs only a little bit more than a first-class letter. And yet it's migrating a couple thousand miles each way, spring and fall. And it depends on the leaf litter and insects in the leaf litter to eat. And it nests in low branches, meaning it's very vulnerable to predators, particularly cats. So this is a species that's now on the watch list for extinction and has declined so dramatically. And yet in my back garden, I have seen wood thrushes. And I think there's all kinds of things we can do to make life better for these migratory birds. I've actually now recorded 81 species of birds using my garden in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I don't expect to see all 81 species every year, but I would hope to see about 45 to 50 species a year. And of those, a lot are neotropical migrants that are the birds that are really, really suffering. And I have also, in addition to the wood thrush, we have had American woodcock here several years in a row, and they're not going to nest in my Cambridge garden. They're going to go nest out in your neck of the woods a little bit more over in, on the Canada, or not Canada, on the New Hampshire, Massachusetts border in more wooded areas. But I'm pleased that they would find my garden a good place to stop over when they're suffering from the end of their migratory flights. And so just so many other warblers and birds that it's really fabulous. So I'll just give you a quick glimpse. Here is a sharp-shinned hawk. And of course, it likes to eat songbirds, so it's looking for songbirds to eat. Why do I get so many species? I think the answer is obvious. What do we all need? We need habitat. We need a place to hang our heads. We need a place to hang out, sometimes a place to nest. We need food. And my garden provides a fair amount of that. Here's a red-bellied woodpecker, more common species these last few decades. It's gotten a more northerly range than it used to have. Here's the Wilson's warbler. And it's in those famous amelanchier trees, but notice it's not eating the berries, it's eating the caterpillar. So here's a great example of how the amelanchias people think of the berries as feeding the bird, but it's a native plant that's feeding that Wilson's warbler, a caterpillar. One thing statistic that Doug Tallamy has often cited is that it can take between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to feed one clutch of chickadees. So 2 chickadees make a nest, maybe they lay 6 eggs. For those 6 eggs, when they hatch, to survive as nestlings and grow into birds that can fly, 6,000 caterpillars. So imagine if you need that many for one set of nesting chickadees, how much we need for our native birds as a whole. Here's the white-throated sparrow, a beautiful bird that loves to hop back and forth in the leaf litter in order to stir up the insects and catch them. Here's a veery, one of the birds in the thrush family. Here's a northern water thrush. And I mentioned to you that I have that part of the back garden that floods when we get the rains, and you can see there's a little water. Actually, this is that patch that has the clethra and the high bush blueberry. And so here was the northern water thrush because we'd had a lot of rain. I've had a scarlet tanager. I apologize for the blurriness of the photo, but I was pretty excited to see a scarlet tanager in my Cambridge backyard. Of course, we all have robins. Robins are one of the stable species that are doing well with human habitation. They always pretend that you can't see them when they're nesting. Gray catbirds. If you want to support bird life in your garden, it is important to have a water source. And in this case, what I do is I simply have this bird bath, which I fill with the hose every few days, rinse it out. I don't worry about keeping it crystal clean. Leaves fall in it, that's fine. There's insects and good things for them to eat, but I might hose it out once a week or something like that. And that definitely really helps the birds. They need the water. The one thing I would caution is if you have cats in the neighborhood, that also then makes them vulnerable. And so you really want to keep predators away if you have a bird bath like this that's on the ground. Hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are actually adapting pretty well to human habitation. And there is so much that we can plant to support hummingbirds. You can put up a hummingbird feeder, but you're not going to be giving them much nutrition when you just give them the sugar water. So this is cardinal flower, a wonderful native plant, and they are uniquely adapted to getting the nectar out of those long tubular cardinal flower flowers. Here's American goldfinch, which is in the thuya. And so the thuya's got the seeds. This is late November, early December, and every year the goldfinches love those seeds. Here's a red-tailed hawk we have in the neighborhood, and I have seen it in my neighborhood. I've seen it in my backyard eating crow, eating squirrel, once with a rat. It's a good predator to have around. And so in sum, I now have well over 100 native species in my garden, and I'm not proposing that everybody necessarily plant that many species. There's a lot to be said for massing plants and making bigger patches of plants like cardinal flower and things that will be more evident to birds and wildlife and be good food sources. But I'm a bit of a plantaholic. So, but the bottom line is that the bulk of my garden is now native, and it's very active with insect life and bird life. And it's just been incredibly, incredibly rewarding to have that happen. Again, I mentioned the leaf litter that makes everything is got some rich component of life going on, from the high upper story of the tops of the trees, where you'll see certain species of birds, to the mid-level, to the ground plane, etc. And every part of that ecosystem tends to get different species of birds and different things happening depending on who's adapted to those particular conditions. So I'm going to tell you one more bird story before finishing up, which is that I got so excited about this that around the year, maybe 2006 or 7, I began advocating with my husband for creating a snag, a piece of standing deadwood, because I said, if we create a snag, I wonder if we could get woodpeckers to nest here in our garden. And I had to twist my husband's arm, I'll admit. He wasn't too keen on it. This was a river birch tree right here that we had planted many years before. And there had been a large silver maple right here. And I had planted the river birch here because aesthetically, I didn't want the silver maple smack in the middle of the back garden where it was. So it was an aesthetic decision. But when it came time to cut this down, the last part of this down, because the river birch had grown fairly large, that was when I got the idea to create the snag. And you can see here that in the growing season, it's pretty well disguised. I would have rather had a naturally occurring snag if I had more land with lots of dead branches, but it worked. And what's incredibly exciting to me is that the experiment worked. So this was 5 years after we created that snag, cut down that last trunk, and it was starting to rot enough that here was the downy woodpecker in April. And it obviously was April 6th, actually. And obviously this is a male. He's got the red spot in the back of the head, and he'd started to dig a hole for his, or peck a hole for his nest. And he'd been working for a number of days. The northern flicker came along to check out Mr. Downey's work. And this is a male flicker, you can tell by the mustache. And flickers will sometimes look to use an abandoned downy woodpecker nest, but this nest was not abandoned. And go away. So the male came back, and he's digging, he's pecking the hole every day and spitting wood chips out of the hole. And finally, after about 2 weeks of work, it took him 2 weeks to this point, he got into that hole, was getting into the center of the trunk far enough that he was able to turn around and get out. And here comes the female. So she comes to inspect the hole. And even though the reliable bird encyclopedias from Cornell Lab and National Audubon and other places say that the male and the female share the nest building, in this case, I will say that it did seem to me that the male had done a lot more of the work, and it had taken him several weeks. But she came by and inspected, and then there was a period where they fluttered together, and I was like, I think they're mating, but I don't know if I'm supposed to be seeing this. And then it got very quiet, and so quiet for several weeks that we did not know if they had successfully made a nest. We could not see them coming and going. We couldn't hear anything. And then May 31st, this is about 6 weeks since we first saw the male making that nest hole. Here's the female. And we began to notice that they were flying back and forth to the nest all the time. And in their beaks are these wads of caterpillars. And I think if you can see here, there are probably about 8 caterpillars in her beak. And woodpeckers have barbs on their tongue, which makes it easier for them to pick up these caterpillars and hold them. And she is feeding this little guy. And he is whining and complaining and sticking his head out of the hole and asking for food. And the male and female, literally, talk about the number of caterpillars that might need to feed them. They were flying back and forth, constantly feeding this little guy. Well, it's June 1st. It's 3:29 p.m. It's 6 weeks since the parents mated. They've had about 2 weeks to incubate the eggs and 3 to 4 weeks for those newly hatched woodpecker chicks to grow up. And he's about to fledge. What happened is the male and the female stopped feeding him so much. And they were kind of hovering around to see what to watch, to see what he'd do. But he would be whining and complaining and sticking his head out of the hole more and more. And so finally, he thrust himself out of the hole, grabbed the side of the tree. He climbed up to the top of that snag and rested for a minute. He flew over to those amelanchier trees. Notice I said it's June 1st, and you see the berries on the June berries. And then he flew to the chimocypress tree in the middle of the yard, and he rested for just a half minute, a minute. This little guy, like, out of the hole, and he can fly. It's so amazing. So he rested, and then he carefully climbed up the tree trunk, and he would eat insects gleaned from the bark of the tree as he flew up. And then 12 minutes after fledging from the nest hole, he flew out of the yard. And left behind was his little sister. And we had very creative names for the two of them. We called them Big Bro and Little Sis. And Big Bro had actually been sitting on Little Sis's head. She had not been the first one with the head out of the hole, and she had not been fed quite as much, and she was a little bit weaker than her brother. But she was in that nest for a few more days. And then finally, 3 mornings later, I came back from a meeting, and I knew she wasn't in the hole anymore. I could just tell by the absence of sound. And high up in the garden, in a tree, there she was. She had fledged, and then she too flew off out of the yard. And so this was a remarkable experiment for me. And this was 2008. And I will say that to sit in my backyard or my back porch in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and have coffee and watch this whole thing happening and see that this is possible on a relatively small piece of land really is what gives me hope for all of us, that there is so much we can do to support bird life and to create habitat. So if you want to create habitat for birds, just think about these principles. Vertical edge is just a fun term for the fact that you need everything from your very high canopy to your mid-level canopy, to your low canopy, to your low shrubby areas, to your ground plane. And again, each area is going to tend to have different species or different things going on. The orioles love to be high up. The flickers love to be down at the ground. Water we talked about a little bit, and then cover is so important both for gleaning, for insects, for foraging, for nesting. Keeping predators away is so important. The two biggest killers of birds are skyscrapers and cats. Both of them are really believed to be one of the major causes of loss of songbirds, in addition to the loss of habitat. And then snags are good not only up in the air, but putting a log in your garden and having it artistically become part of the garden and something that you plant around and that generally rots over time and has its own rich soil enriching insect life things happening. All of these things are good things to do. And of course, not using pesticides. Tufts Wildlife Clinic did a study back in the 1980s of all the raptors that were brought in. And they found that even if the raptors were brought in for broken wings, that 90% of them had some level of rodenticide poisoning in their blood. And so we got to get away from using these types of chemicals outside in the ecosystem where, let's say a mouse or a rat eats it, goes somewhere and dies, the raptor comes and eats that mouse. All of these poisons bioaccumulate in their blood and are major sources of of loss of life for that class of birds. So these are our three big reasons for why to use native plants. And then I want to give you my three keys to success. Really pay attention to your site. Get to know your site and enjoy that as part of your research on plant selection and what you choose. I could have saved myself a lot of effort and time and money if I had understood how important that was to begin with, and to really say, that's what I want to work with. It's not the way most, the horticultural work trains us, the horticultural world trains us, but understanding that every garden is its own system, and find ways to work with your system, not against your system. So one of my great excitements about leaf litter and how much I'm able to use leaf litter, and I won't say that I never use mulch. If I'm doing a new planting and I need to establish a little area, I may use a little bit of mulch when I first plant it, just to suppress weeds in those first year while things are growing in. But the more I work with ecological systems and don't have to do a lot of artificial bringing in of mulch and raking leaves, in theory, I can go bicycling more, and I like that. So again, I once had a neighbor's landscaper get out his leaf blowers, and not only was he blowing my neighbor's garden, he started to blow the leaves in my garden, and I went out to say, stop, those are my leaves, leave my leaves alone. And he's like, lady, if you don't blow the leaves, your plants won't germinate in the spring. And I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, what the heck did those plants do before leaf blowers? So rest assured that your plants will germinate if you leave the leaves. And the final thing I would say about leaf litter is how important it is for so many parts of life. This is just a couple examples. The hummingbird moth, which is right here, hummingbird moth at some bee balm. So moths spin their cocoon in the leaf litter. If there's no leaf litter, they can't spin their cocoon and they won't reproduce. Right now is the time of the year where the bumblebee queens are just emerging. And all of our native bumblebees, of which there are 11 species in Massachusetts, about 4 of which are at risk of extinction at this point. Of all the bumblebees, only the queen survives the winter. So if the queen doesn't survive, there will be no new colony next year, and there will be no new bumblebees. And the queen hibernates generally in a little teeny hole in the ground right under the leaf litter to protect it. So without the right habitat, we cannot have hibernating queen bumblebees survive. And then this here is a mourning cloak butterfly. And believe it or not, this species, every species of butterfly has different reproductive systems, but this species, the adult actually overwinters as an adult in the leaf litter, which I find completely remarkable. How does that butterfly survive in that leaf litter layer through an entire winter? And yet it does, and it has to come out in the spring and find its partner and mate to make more mourning cloak butterflies. So leave your leaves, use native plants, and I am sure that your garden matters just as much as mine. Our mission at Grow Native is to inspire you to use more native plants because of the diversity of life they support. I hope that this has helped to do that. I will say that if you're not familiar with the Grow Native website, please take advantage of it. We have so much material for you. Under this section, Know Your Landscape, so much to explain the issue in general, to help you get started, to talk about these issues in detail. And then particularly under the Great Resources section, we have a whole page of nurseries for where you can buy native plants, and books that we think are the best books for you to use, and databases that are helpful for learning about flora and fauna and identifying things, etc. So please take advantage of that website. And then also, if you've enjoyed this talk, there's a little bit more information about me and the work that I do on my own website, as I retired from the Grow Native board this past year. And that's claudiagthompson.com. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my misbehaving screen, which I apologize for any gray spots that Zoom caused. I would love to take as many questions as we have time for.
Oh, well, Claudia, first of all, thank you so much for the wonderful, informative presentation. So really appreciate it. I have a deck, but I'm probably in pots. I'm sure I can still grow the native plants. So
You can, absolutely.
So I'm going to start. I'm not going to do these in order. I'm going to start off with a question that came up a couple of times. I think because people couldn't read the names of the plants, there have been requests for maybe it's on Grow Native, but a list of where they can find native plants and the spelling, and maybe what's in your garden, and this, a list of perhaps what's in your garden, or would it just be sort of a general list of native plants that they could find?
So, I mean, if you like, I can happily. I don't know if you have a way of. Do you have a way of reaching?
Yes, from everyone that's registered, I could send something. If you
I'm happy to forward a list of the species that I have used in my garden. If you want to forward that to people,
yep,
it's going to be a much longer list.
Yes. Okay.
What I would suggest for everybody who's trying to get to know these plants more, what I find most helpful, go to the best books page on the Grow Native Massachusetts website under Great Resources. And we have about 45 books there recommended. And what I found super helpful for me, the best book, the 1-volume book, we'll go to the Wilmington Library or go to your local library and see what they have. But there's a book by Donald J. Leopold that's a 1-volume book called Native Plants for the Northeast. And so it's got a chapter on ferns, it's got a chapter on perennials, it's got a chapter on trees, a chapter on shrubs. And I find that using those books to peruse the plants and see what they look like and read about them, super helpful. His book is a good one. The books by Bill Kalina, William Kalina that are out of print are like the Bible for native plants, but they're all listed up there on the website. And so you can see whether either you want to order one or buy one or borrow it from your library, and really they're great resources for learning about these plants. And the other thing I will say that, you could read the Missouri Botanic Gardens description online, or you could read Bill Kalina's description of the same species, and everybody will give you a slightly different take on the qualities of that plant and what it likes or doesn't like, sun or shade, soil, etc. And that's because it's so hard in many ways to really adequately describe how complex plants are and really understand the very fine details of what makes them do well or not do well. But books are a great place to start. They really are.
Okay, I'll check for that book. And if we don't have the first one that you mentioned, the Native Plants for the Northeast, we'll order it if it's available.
And there are just so many good books listed there that are helpful.
And we may be able to get it from other libraries. And if you send me the list of the plants in your garden, I will send it to the group. But give me a little time, maybe tomorrow.
No, do it now.
I'm going to go back to one of the first questions, and that is bloodroot poisonous?
I don't believe so. I mean, I wouldn't eat it at all. Bloodroot, I believe, was used by quite a number of the native tribes for certain ailments. It's not something I would just go out and do, because I think you'd want to be careful about that. I personally have used, and this I'm not going to recommend this unless you were to use your own bloodroot, and most of you aren't going to have enough bloodroot colonies. First of all, do not dig it or take it from any land that's not your own. It is a very slow growing plant. And the pictures of the bloodroot in my garden, I started with 4 plants. It probably took 10 years before they germinated and spread enough to get those colonies. And I will say that somehow, very sadly, a lot of my bloodroot has died back in the last few years. And I've even asked some of the country's experts on this, and occasionally that happens and not everybody knows why. So no, I think medicinally bloodroot was used by certain tribes, but I would not recommend going out and doing that. And I doubt you're going to have enough on your property to to do that anyway. It can be used as a dye. It was used by Native Americans to dye things.
Can you recommend some plants that are deer resistant that are native?
Oh my gosh, that is such a huge issue for us. And the best thing to do there are, I would say, some of the databases that we have listed on our website will start to list plants that are rabbit resistant or deer resistant. I would have to, it's such, I mean, there are probably 300 or 400 species horticulturally to choose from. So, off the top of my head, it's hard for me to just say, they probably don't like juniper very much. Are we talking about perennials? Are we talking about shrubs? Are we talking about trees? But definitely check out the Lady Bird Johnson site, their database, and the Missouri Botanical Garden database, both of which you can link to from the Grow Native Mass website, or you can Google yourselves, because when they list every species, they try to start giving that information. Do they think it's deer resistant or rabbit resistant? The deer are so overpopulated in Massachusetts. This is a policy problem that really needs to, if possible, be addressed at a much broader level, which isn't to say that those of us having gardens don't have to still struggle with, if we have deer in our area, which I know you guys do, what do we plant or not plant? Sorry, it's not, I'm not able to just rattle the list off, but.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Plants that hinder the spread of poison ivy. Are there any? Any suggestions?
I mean, so if you have poison ivy on your property and you're trying to control it, first of all, I think you can use, if you use it very judiciously, I think certainly using glyphosate as a cut stem, let's say you have some bigger stems that you need to suppress. I think doing that is a wise thing to do. No, I don't think that there are any plants per se that will suppress poison ivy at all. I'm not aware of any. The more you have a healthy understory growing, the better. But will poison ivy still germinate? Probably yes. And so again, if you're trying to control it, you need to get rid of the big stems of it. And then you need to monitor and carefully remove and pull up smaller ones. Poison ivy is a native plant. So, and it is, the berries of poison ivy actually do have food value for birds. So I totally get that we don't like poison ivy where we walk and have particularly small gardens, but it is not a totally bad plant from that perspective.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the leaf cover? I have someone here asking about leftover leaves from last year. Is it better to leave them where they are, or is it okay to move them to areas that have more plantings? And do you ever like mulch your leaves and put them back, or do you just kind of let nature take its course and just don't do anything?
Right. So I do not remove leaves and put them back. That would violate my, I'm trying to be efficient and let the ecological system work for me rule. Right. In the garden, the pictures that you saw, the leaf litter that is coming down on that woodland portion of my garden consists of some cherry leaves from my neighbor, the Amelanchier leaves from my garden, some Carpinus, which is commonly called ironwood by some people, leaves. And so that leaf litter just comes down and sits there, and the soil ecosystem, all the creatures in the soil basically cycle those leaves into becoming part of the soil within that next year. So by the time fall comes around and the next set of leaves come down, the soil has been enriched and restored, and it has, the leaf litter has served as a weed suppressing layer the way mulch does. And no, I don't do anything in that woodland section of the garden. Now, on the little bit of grass that I have, I rake the leaves and save them in the back to use with my compost pile. Or sometimes there is a back shrubby area where I will, in the fall, rake some of the leaves off the grassy area and add the extra leaves back into the shrubby area. If you were to create a really thick layer of leaves, you would suppress growth in that area. So, if you turn it into a pile, or if you turn it into 6 inches thick, that's more than the natural system would give you, and you are going to be suppressing growth in your garden. But no, I don't rake them and put them back. I don't grind them up. Because if you grind up leaves, you're grinding up all kinds of caterpillars. You're grinding up all kinds of valuable life when you do that. Things like that hummingbird moth cocoon and so many other really important life forms.
So you just leave it alone and let
I
nature.
leave it alone.
Two other leaf questions. One is, are oak leaves acceptable as leaf litter? And the other one, does the leaf litter produce tree seedlings?
Well, only trees produce tree seedlings. But think about the woods, you know, all kinds of trees germinate in the woods. So yes,
I'm thinking of the leaves and whatever else comes down, the seeds and the, you know, whatever else. Leaving things alone, would it produce the seedlings as well?
Yes, and sorry, what was the first part of that question?
Oak leaves, are they acceptable?
Oh, oak leaves, right. So oak leaves, definitely oak leaves take more than a year to break down. Oak leaves are some of the toughest species in terms of breaking down. And so I think, you know, it depends on what you have growing around. If you take a walk in the woods, particularly if you're in like an classic oak pine woodland, you'll see so many beautiful wildflowers that are beautifully adapted to coming up through that oak leaf litter. The classic being Mianthemum canadense, which is Canada Mayflower. It's sometimes people call it the native lily of the valley. It is only, the leaves are only a few inches tall, and they shoot right up through the oak leaves and the pine needles. And they make this gorgeous understory that is perfectly adapted to coming up through those conditions. So I don't personally have an oak tree in my garden. If I did, I would definitely be wanting to make sure that what I have planted does successfully come germinate every spring through that leaf litter. But I think there are many native plants that would do that.
Thank you. Is witch hazel that blooms in March not native?
There is one native species of witch hazel called Hamamelis vernalis that is a native. It's native more to Missouri and the Ozarks than it is to New England, but it can be purchased and used here. However, most of what we see in this area are non-natives. So the famous, you know, the Arnold is it what is it? It's named after the Arnold Arboretum. There's many cultivars and hybrids of witch hazels that bloom in the spring that are not native at all, that are crosses with Asian witch hazels.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to Clethra, Clethra is spreading out of control. Any suggestions?
Clethra spreading out of control. Wow. Well, it does sucker. And I don't know how big the garden is. I mean, and I don't know what is it spreading into lawn. If it's spreading into lawn, I would just mow it, because, you know, anytime you mow stuff, the woodies can't grow. But I don't find it overly aggressive. It definitely will spread by suckering, but not in a, you know, completely out of control way to me. But it must really like the conditions. So
You're something right. What is the species name of winterberry with the small berries?
So Ilex verticillata.
Can you say that again?
Yeah, verticillata. Verticillata. So that's I showed you the ones that have the small red berries, and it's the straight species, the ones that are not cultivars, that are grown from seed, that have the small berries. If any of you go to Plum Island and take a walk there in the fall, you'll see beautiful stands of Ilex verticillata. It loves to have its feet wet. So it likes those kinds of conditions. But the cultivars tend to have bigger berries. And in my observation, the birds can't swallow those as much. But the straight species are harder to find, the straight species plants. But it's a wonderful, wonderful plant to have in your garden. And in my case, what I did was, so if you buy a cultivar, they'll know whether it's a male or a female. And that's why, you know, that's why a lot of nurseries sell the cultivars, because then you don't know. If you have a straight species plant, the only way you could tell if it's a male or female is when it's in flower. And then you have to look at those flowers and say, is that a male flower, or does it have stamens? And they're pretty small flowers to begin with, or is it a female flower? Or you can figure out, does it produce berries? And of course, if it produces berries, it's a female. So if you are able to find straight species Ilex verticillata, the way to ensure that you have males and females and that you're going to get berries is to buy 5 or 6 or 7 plants and plant them in a clump. And then it's highly unlikely you're going to get all males or females. The other thing that I did was I bought a cultivar that was a male, and I put him in the back of my garden. And I put some ones that I knew were females where I knew I wanted to have the berries. But you know, the nice thing to do if you have straight species is to buy a bunch and put them in, and you've got a beautiful stand that's kind of naturally occurring with berries on some and not on others.
Thank you. Is Nepeta a native species? Nepeta?
That's not ringing a bell for me. Nepeta.
No. I think I wrote it correctly. I can double check, but we'll move on to the next question. Do you have to be careful about buying plants that are sold as native?
Oh, always.
Should they native message? What would you look for if you went to a nursery and wanted to buy native plants to Massachusetts? Is there anything that would sort of certify it as being so?
Only your knowledge.
Okay.
So what happened for me was that as I started to get really, first of all, I remember thinking, oh, I'll never learn those Latin names because I'm no good at Latin, and languages weren't my favorite subject in school, and I'm not good at memorizing things that don't mean anything to me. So I thought I'll never learn those Latin names. But then what happened was I began to want particular qualities in my plants, and I started reading the books, and I'm like, oh, I would like a Hamamelis virginiana. And all of a sudden, without trying, I began learning the Latin names, which is a nice way to do it, because then you're not thinking that you're trying to memorize something that doesn't mean anything to you. So once you start reading about plants and saying, oh, that might be a great plant to try, and you have a book and you see the picture, that could be really suited to my conditions, then you have to know its Latin name in order to get that species. So without trying, you write it down. You say, yeah, I want the Hamamelis virginiana, and you go to the nursery and you say, do you have Hamamelis virginiana? Mm-hmm. And so unless they've then mislabeled the plant, then you know whether you're getting the native species that you want. And it's not that they don't ever mislabel the species, but that's much less common. Whereas it is much more common for someone to tell you, oh yeah, that's native, when they don't really know, or somebody's just put what's their definition of native? Is it native to the United States? Is it native to New England? So you really, to get what you want, you'll start learning the Latin. And it won't be a bother. It'll actually be fun.
Okay, thank you. And did you have a plan for your garden about where you were going to plant what, or did you sort of just start planting or do you think about where you're going to plant something?
Yeah, no, that's kind of what I was saying, is that, when I started, in some ways we had a plan, like we wanted some more trees here, and we wanted to keep a little bit of the lawn, but we wanted to have a lot of more privacy around the edges. But I didn't have the plan because I didn't know nearly as much. And to the extent that you really can figure out, what do I want to accomplish? And what are the species that would best help me do that? And are there particular butterfly species that I really want to support? So I want to know what the host plants are for those. Or is my property near a wetland, and do I tend to have wet conditions? So what would really thrive well here that's going to be fun? I wasn't that aware 28 years ago. And so I do recommend trying to come up with a plan and a goal. And what happened for me was that as I started realizing I wanted to use natives much more exclusively, I did develop more of a plan over time, but I didn't really start out with my Cambridge garden saying, this is what I want to do. I wasn't aware ecologically of how important natives were back then.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have some more questions. We'll keep going for a while, and I know some people have left, but we're going to continue on with the questions here. English ivy or wood ivy, take it over my yard. What do you recommend?
Muscle and persistence, or hiring a young kid. I don't know. I totally recommend getting rid of it. I have never in my life seen anything ecologically interesting happening in English ivy. I really just don't. I've never seen birds foraging in it. I've never seen it really playing like a functioning part of the ecosystem. And it is a miserable thing to get rid of. It can be done. And so, definitely taking it out and beating it back, which of all the, it isn't actually classified on the mass invasive list. That I would put it in the don't ever use list and remove it myself, but it hasn't really met the criteria for wholesale degradation of an ecosystem, which is really what all the plants the criteria that had to be met for any of those species to be put on it. But I would definitely recommend getting rid of it. And if you have such a big patch of it, do it a bit at a time. Vinca too. My front garden, which is only about, well, let's see, the lot is 48 feet and it's probably 20 feet deep, and there's a front walk and there's a driveway in part of it. So not huge. I very mistakenly, when we were first gardening, put all these nice perennials in and interspersed them all with Vinca. And this was in 1993 or 4. And I remember a gardening friend at the time, it was nothing but native. She said, "You're going to regret that." It's just because she knew how Vinca grows. And sure enough, within 3 years, I regretted it. And I also think it encouraged a lot more earthworms. It's so interesting. Earthworms are not native. And so definitely what we plant does affect how the soil ecosystem develops and changes. And I had an American dogwood, which we had planted, my husband and I had planted in 1993, and had grown up to the 3rd story. It was beautiful, and it died. And it died because at the very base of the trunk, some insect had penetrated the bark of the wood and lived in the cambium layer right between the bark and the tree. And it wasn't dogwood borer, it wasn't that disease, but something compromised the bark of the tree. And the ivy, the vinca in my front garden had grown quite thick, and it was this tall around the base of the dogwood. And there was a zone of moisture there that I think had encouraged this bad thing to happen. And so at the point that I lost my dogwood, which was so beautiful, and I said, Vinca's not native. I mean, you never see an American dogwood in the beautiful woods that it's adapted to with vinca growing around it. It usually has sparse grasses, and the way it grows in the wooded understory is quite different. So at that point, I'm like, I am getting rid of the vinca. I'm finally getting rid of it. And I hired a younger person to work with me, and the two of us for that front, which was 48 feet by, well, we didn't even quite do one little teeny segment. So we probably did a 30-foot by 15-foot swath, and it took us 2 to 3 days. But we took out every piece of vinca and got rid of it at that point. And the number of earthworms that was in there was astounding. It was so astounding. And earthworms prevent some of our native wildlife. They disrupt the roots of a lot of the native wildflowers. So there's documentation about this. And I cannot grow wintergreen. I don't know if any of you try to grow the beautiful native wintergreen, Gaultheria procumbens, because the earthworms disturb the very fine root systems of that. And every time I planted it, they've disturbed it, and the wintergreen has died.
Let's see, can you point me to a good resource to eradicate the Japanese vine that climbs up trees and chokes them off?
Which Japanese vine?
I don't know. Is there a common vine that maybe chokes trees off?
Well, bittersweet is an oriental bittersweet, and I don't know exactly which part of the Orient it is. It may be more than Japan, but oriental bittersweet is probably the most pervasive invasive plant on the. That's the one that people used to collect those red, yellow berries for to make wreaths from. It's a real killer, total killer. And so how to prevent it is the question?
Yeah, in fact, there's a couple of questions on bittersweet. So how, best way to prevent it. Mhm.
So the vines of bittersweet get huge. They get totally, huge pretty quickly. So it wouldn't be uncommon to have, 4-inch or 5-inch across vines when they're mature, and many 2 to 3-inch vines that aren't even that old. So that's a plant that, you can totally cut it. And I would advocate for carefully using a cut stem herbicide method, that you paint the herbicide on the stem, and that herbicide gets carried into the root so that it won't continually germinate. Also bittersweet, because the birds will eat the berries. They actually don't have the same nutritional value that even poison ivy berries do, but you will often find small little bittersweet seedlings germinating in your garden. And if you ever pull them, you'll really know they're bittersweet because they have this very orange root that almost no other plant has. And so if you can recognize them when you're young and pull them before they get big, that's really helpful. You can use something called a weed wrench, which is basically a tool that clamps around the trunk and gives you the power of a lever to pull it out. So if you're trying to pull out a weed, you can pull out a small bittersweet vine using a weed wrench without having to use the herbicide. But it's the combination of factors that have to be used to control something like bittersweet.
I think you answered about 3 people had questions on that. How about lily of the valley? How do you keep it out of the garden?
Dig it. Yeah, it's one of those things that muscle and persistence. And yeah, it's amazing how once it gets established, it just spreads and outcompetes everything else.
Okay. And if
there's a lot of employment for teenagers that's potential.
There we go. I keep them busy. If there was one plant or shrub or tree that one should plant this spring or summer, what would you recommend?
A tree.
A tree, a plant, or a shrub?
Trees.
What would you recommend?
Trees are just the bones of the garden. In terms of the net effect on biodiversity, planting trees and shrubs are far and away the most important thing to do. Trees really have a lasting impact. And then so you want the tree that's really suited to your conditions. Doug Tallamy and many of us are huge advocates for the oak trees. There are many different species, but oaks are known to host some of the highest numbers of caterpillars of any species. But cherries, oaks, they're all really, really great species. Again, if you go to the Grow Native Massachusetts website, there's actually one page on there called Articles and Downloads. And we have so many plant lists on there for you to refer to, that including plant lists on viability of how many caterpillars and things like that. So, but plant an oak tree, plant a cherry tree, plant a tree that's really well suited to your soil conditions and that you're going to love and take care of.
Thank you. And then someone did write in that Nepeta that I mentioned is catmint.
Catmint.
Nepeta, is catmint a native plant? Do you know?
I'm just not familiar with the genus name Nepeta, but that doesn't mean that it's not. I don't think catmint is native though. I'm pretty sure it's not.
Okay. And I think, what about, let's see, get rid of the English. People are wanting to get rid of things. Let's see. Here's one more question. We'll end it on this. My garden is under or near lots of pine trees. Will the pine needles help as mulch, or should I remove them?
Oh, I love that question.
Good one.
So you probably have pretty acidic soil, which means you can grow all kinds of plants I wish I could grow. So absolutely leave them. They're there doing great work for you. And when I removed the vinca that I talked about in my front garden and tried to I planted 2 new dogwood trees because I felt so badly about losing the beautiful one that we'd grown for 20 years. And I really love the American dogwood. I went to a friend's house in Lincoln who has lots of pine trees. And I collected off of her driveways about 7 or 8 bags, leaf bags of pine needles, and brought them back to use it as mulch in my front garden. I think pine needles make a great mulch. They actually, one nice thing about pine needles is that they do take several years to break down. And so if you are putting in new plantings and wanting to just kind of have that weed suppressing layer, as well as people have mixed opinions on whether that will make your soil any more acidic or not. The acidity of the soil is going to be determined by a couple of things. It's going to be determined in part by what's inherently there, what your bedrock is, what nature left for you, which is why I can't, with clay on being the base of my conditions, that's more of a neutral to alkaline soil. And so I don't have super acidic soil in my Cambridge garden. But depending on what kind of bedrock is in your area, you may have more acidic soil. And so again, I would suggest working with the plants that are adapted to those conditions. But I love pine needles. Wonderful, wonderful farm mulch. And that, again, look up my Anthemum canadense. If I could, I was just looking through my photo library today and have so many photographs of the beautiful understory of my Anthemum in the spring that comes up through the oaks and pines. It's a hard plant to find in the nursery trade. There, occasionally I've been able to find it. I think it's one of these delicate New England wildflowers that I'd love to see much more commercially available. But there are a lot of other plants that will grow in those conditions.
Well, Claudia, thank you so much. I really appreciate the talk today. It was very informative, inspirational. I'm ready to plant only native species up on my deck, and really appreciate everything that you gave us today.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for your love of native plants.
And thank everyone for tuning in. And we will have the recording up. And Claudia, if you send the list to me, I will get that emailed out to everyone.
Great.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.